High stakes, critical timing. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrapping up a two-day visit to China to help repair the fractured relationship between Washington and Beijing and get the two superpowers talking again. Blinken spoke a short time after meeting with President Xi Jinping.
With regard to crisis communications and military-to-military channels, this is also something that I raised repeatedly during this trip. I think it's absolutely vital that we have these kind of communications, military to military. That imperative, I think, was only underscored by recent incidents that we saw in the air and on the seas. At this moment, China has not agreed to move forward with that. I think that's an issue that we have to keep working on.
CNN national security correspondent Kylie Atwood is in Beijing and joins us now. So both sides really kind of downplaying any big breakthroughs here during Blinken's visit. Is there a sense, though, that this was successful in terms of a first step, Kylie?
I think that's exactly it, Erica. The Secretary of State called this a healthy dialogue, said it was candid, said it was constructive. Basically, what he was able to do over the course of the last 2 days here in Beijing was really effectively engage his Chinese counterparts, something that he hasn't done here in Beijing to date. This was his first visit to China as Secretary of State, the first Biden cabinet official to visit China. But we really should note that they didn't make progress on one of the key issues that the Biden administration was hoping to push the ball forward on. That is military-to-military channels of communication between the U.S. and China. As you heard in that introduction, the secretary told me that that was something that he raised repeatedly with his Chinese counterparts here in Beijing. He said it is critical to establish those channels, but it's not something that China agreed to do on this visit. He says that is something that the United States will continue working on. And I asked him why the United States would be sending other U.S. officials to China in the coming weeks if they wouldn't agree to these military-to-military channels, because he did say that there is the expectation for further administration officials to visit Beijing. He essentially said that, there needs to be engagement between the two sides. Diplomacy, talking to one another is more effective than not having those conversations. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, the secretary said that China has said that it will not provide lethal aid to Russia to be used in the war in Ukraine. He said that isn't a new position necessarily for China, but he reiterated concerns to his Chinese counterparts about Chinese companies providing that lethal aid to Russia. And then it's also important to note when it comes to issues of economic stability, he said that he really sought to make sure that the Chinese knew that the United States isn't trying to contain them. They're trying to make sure that they take actions that protect the United States in the realm of national security. And that is leading the Biden administration's policies that have angered the Chinese counterparts in some areas, specifically on semiconductors and the like. He also mentioned human rights, the Americans who are wrongfully detained here in China, among other issues. And of course, we'll watch to see what happens over the course of the following days as this meeting is really kind of digested in Washington.
Yeah, so important. And glad that you were there to ask those questions, Kylie. Thank you.
Taiwan is caught in the middle of this complicated relationship. Beijing's top foreign affairs advisor says that there's no room for compromise when it comes to Taiwan, while Secretary Blinken says the U.S. position has not changed.
Were there to be a crisis over Taiwan, the likelihood is that that would produce an economic crisis that could affect quite literally the entire world. President Biden believes strongly that one of the successful aspects of our relationship with China going back 5 decades has been the responsible management of the Taiwan question. We continue to believe that that's essential.
CNN's chief national security correspondent Jim Sciutto is with us now. Jim, you were in Taiwan last week. What's the Taiwan government perspective on their role in this tense relationship?
Well, frankly, they're worried about getting caught in the middle, right, between two superpowers, as they are, and as was made clear by this meeting between Blinken and Xi and other senior Chinese officials. It's good that they're talking, but there is still a great distance between the U.S. and Washington, between the U.S. and China on the Taiwan issue. Taiwan taking the threat of Chinese military action very seriously. They're preparing every day. I watched military exercises there, preparing for the possibility of a Chinese invasion, but they're deliberately trying to avoid provoking China. They prefer the status quo. They don't want it to escalate. And they, of course, have a hand in that, their own actions, but they also worry about the hands of other superpowers, China and the U.S. here. It's good that China and the U.S. are talking about this issue, but in their public comments, you see there is still great distance. Secretary Blinken accused China of provocative actions in the Taiwan Strait, placing the blame on China. For instance, we saw a Chinese jet fly close to a U.S. surveillance aircraft recently, a Chinese warship sail close to a U.S. warship recently. And then you have China on the other side, basically warning the U.S. away from any upset to the one China policy, as it's known. So big picture on the issue of Taiwan, good that the superpowers are talking here, but those talks show there's still a lot of distance there. And one specific point, as Kylie was noting, the U.S. wanted to come out of these meetings with an agreement on military-to-military contacts so that those incidents, as we've seen recently, don't escalate into something bigger. They didn't leave with an agreement on such contacts.
Yeah, important that there was no progress on that, no immediate progress, according to the Secretary. Jim Sciutto, thanks.
Thanks.
Joining us now, the president of the Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer. Ian, good to see you this morning. Based on what we heard, what we learned from Secretary Blinken, calling this healthy, candid, constructive, saying to our own Kylie Atwood that he had raised the matter about communications channels, specifically those military-to-military communications channels, raised it repeatedly. There's no movement on that front. What is your main takeaway based on what we're hearing from both officials in terms of how you would classify this meeting and this trip?
Well, first, how I'd classify it would be positive. The main takeaway, which I haven't heard anyone mention yet, is the fact that President Xi Jinping decided to meet with Tony Blinken. Tony's not the head of state. He's Secretary of State. That is an intentional and symbolically important move by the Chinese government to show a desire to continue to work constructively on the relationship. And I firmly expect on the back of that Xi Jinping will be coming to the United States absent any sudden crisis, to the APEC summit in San Francisco this fall, where President Biden intends to be for a couple of days. So that's what everyone is going to be focusing on and talking about for the future. But as you suggest, the reality is that we do not have any high-level military-to-military ties. We don't have arms agreements with the Chinese as they are dramatically expanding their nuclear capabilities, their advanced defense capabilities, their AI capabilities in national security. And as we've seen in the past few weeks, there have been a couple of near-miss intentional provocations/accidents in the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea. And if the Americans and Chinese end up directly in conflict by mistake, we don't have the level of trust or engagement on the defense side to try to bring down those tensions. So the relationship is incredibly important. It's also becoming more dangerous.
Secretary Blinken says that the U.S. And other countries have received assurances from the Chinese government that they would not be providing lethal aid to Russia in their war on Ukraine. He did say that they do not have that assurance as it relates to Chinese companies. Without that assurance about the companies and sending components potentially, what's the assurance from the government worth?
Well, it's worth a fair amount in the sense that the Chinese government does not want to be called out for providing that level of support going forward. And of course, when you talk about the defense sector, Chinese-owned, state-owned corporations and state-linked corporations are the most important in the space. So the government does have a lot more control and ownership than the U.S. government does, or any sort of free market democracy. Also keep in mind that this is not just about believing the Chinese, it's about verification and deterrence. The United States found out that there were Chinese government activities to provide support militarily. That was never executed on, but there was such engagement. The Americans not only called the Chinese out on that back in February, but they also made it public, as did the UK, as did NATO. That embarrassed the Chinese, but it also made it very clear that there would be direct secondary U.S. sanctions against Chinese companies if that were to pass. That would be a radically worse U.S.-China relationship than we presently have. China's having a hard time with a strong growth this year. They're thinking about stimulus on the back of their end of zero COVID policy. They don't need that kind of an economic fight with the Americans. So this is less about trust. This is more about capabilities.